Good evening, everyone, and thank you for being with us. Tonight, we bring you a very special 5x15 on the war in Ukraine. Today marks day 285 of the Russian invasion, and as the war enters its winter phase, we're very glad to have two speakers with us this evening who can make sense of this devastating conflict. From the political factors that motivated Vladimir Putin's decision to invade, to everyday stories of hope and survival on the Ukrainian front line. The award-winning journalist Luke Harding has written an extraordinary book called Invasion. It is, as various people have said, a compelling, moving, and important account of the first months of this war. As Lise Doucette noted in her review of the book for The Observer, this conflict has had a rather astonishing arc. From the initial disbelief and fear back in February that Ukraine would be outmanned and outgunned by Russia's military force, to an inspiring tale of perseverance and unwavering belief in victory. This is the story told by Luke's book. Please do buy yourselves a copy, and all author royalties from this edition will go to the DEC's Ukraine Humanitarian Appeal. Details for both of our speakers' books will be posted in the chat this evening. Luke is a foreign correspondent for The Guardian and has reported on wars around the world. Between 2007 and 2011, he was The Guardian's Moscow bureau chief. He was expelled from Russia by the Kremlin and this summer placed on an official blacklist. Luke is the author of several other books, including Mafia State, WikiLeaks, and the Snowden Files. Tonight, Luke will be in conversation with Gideon Rachman, the chief foreign affairs correspondent for the Financial Times. Gideon is also the author of the brilliant book, The Age of the Strongman, which examines the new nationalism in Russia, Europe, and beyond, and asks what forces are in place to keep autocrats in check. As usual with 5x15, Gideon Luke will be in conversation for around 40-45 minutes, after which time you'll get to ask your questions. So please do post any questions you have for Luke and Gideon in the Q&A box at any time during the event, and we'll get to as many as we can. Gideon, over to you.
Okay, thanks very much, Jack, and thanks to you all for organising this event. It's a great privilege to speak to Luke. I last saw him at a kind of rather civilised London dinner party, but before the invasion, before all those horrors were unleashed. I've spent the last couple of days reading the book, and it really is a great achievement. So congratulations. I mean, I think the blend of reportage and analysis really works brilliantly, and I wasn't sure there was that much left to be said about the Ukraine war, but you convinced me. I learned a lot through reading the book. So well done, and thanks for joining us. So Luke, you start fair enough at the beginning, at the days before the invasion, and like you, I mean, I remember I was not in Ukraine. I was at the Munich Security Conference where Zelensky appeared, and I remember going to a dinner of Ukrainians, having been told in no uncertain terms by sort of British and Americans that the war would start next week. But the Ukrainians did not believe it, or at least some of the ones I was talking to were still saying, maybe it won't happen. You, however, you were in Kiev and you were convinced that Putin would invade and had been convinced for some time. So why was that?
Yeah, well, hello, everybody. Thank you, Gideon. Thank you, Jack. Thank you, 5x15. Great to be with you this evening. I think the reason I was so kind of pessimistic was based on the fact that I spent 4 years in Moscow and had been there as a correspondent for The Guardian between 2007 and 2011, when really Russia was getting darker and was going further down this autocratic strongman path, to use the sort of noun from your very good book, The Age of the Strongman. And when I mean, it's kind of pointless sort of trying to peer inside Vladimir Putin's head, but generally speaking, if you've got a kind of bad option with Russian sort of policy making, foreign policy, and a really bad option, it's always a good idea to bet on the really bad option. And basically, like everyone else, in the autumn of 2021, I looked at these tanks being sent demonstratively, I would say, to Ukraine's borders, to Belarus, over the Kerch Strait to occupied Crimea, and at the same time, Putin was making these crazy maximalist demands, saying NATO should essentially retreat from Central Europe and the clock should be turned back to the early 1990s. And I assume this was for real. This was not a bluff or a diplomatic maneuver or a stratagem, that actually this presaged a large-scale military operation. And so what I did was in December of last year, I've been covering Ukraine for about 15 years, but I went back to the front line to Donetsk, where I'd been in 2014 when Putin had kickstarted a sort of pro-Moscow uprising, if you can call it that, in the east of the country. I spent time with Ukrainian soldiers. We got shot at by Russian snipers as we were going along a muddy field towards a sort of frontline airport position. And then back in Kiev, I mean, you're right. I was talking to Ukrainian sources, and they were acknowledging the threat was real, but also it had been Christmas. There was this air of kind of unreality about it. But the one thing that they were conceding in January was that there was this place called Mariupol, which was very vulnerable. I'd been to Mariupol in 2014, and so I went to Mariupol and made a film for the Guardian. This city on the Sea of Azov, important Ukrainian port, about 15 kilometers away from where Russia and its proxies were encamped, and where again there were gunshots, there were grenade launchers being fired, and there was death. So I went to Mariupol, and then sort of drove along the Sea of Azov towards the border with Crimea, and it was surreal. I was looking at Crimea again with Ukrainian forces. This is in sort of late January, early February, and there were a bit of pedestrian traffic. It was incredibly tranquil, beautiful, with ducks and isthmuses and so on. And it just sort of seemed to me, driving through Kherson, that actually Ukraine was unprepared for what was coming. And you're right, Gideon. I mean, the Brits and the Americans, I think perhaps haunted, rightly or wrongly, by what happened with Iraq, were very, very clear in their intelligence, and they were saying that this actually was going to happen. But actually, the government of Volodymyr Zelensky at that point, sort of sagging in the opinion polls, was in a state of denial. And I'm not sure if this was strategic denial because secretly they were preparing, or actually they just could not recognize the whirlwind, the tornado that was coming towards them.
Yeah, and you record in the book. I mean, you met Zelensky just a few days before the invasion, and he's wavering on this subject of whether there was going to be an attack. But talk a bit about the transformation in Zelensky, because I think most people, who are not professionals following Ukraine, only get to know him after the war and see him, correctly as this heroic figure. But he was a much more equivocal and in some ways a politician in trouble just ahead of the war, wasn't he?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, it's been a remarkable transformation, and I note that the Financial Times, my well-thumbed copy of the Financial Times, has just named him as Personality of the Year. I think correctly, because he's become the outstanding global politician, I think, of his generation, an extraordinary wartime leader. But it wasn't always like that. And the kind of great irony is that Zelensky won a landslide in 2019. I was in Kiev in the spring of 2019 covering the presidential election on a peace ticket. He basically said, I am the person who will sit down with Vladimir Putin, negotiate peace, end the war in the East. And people bought it. I mean, they were tired of war. And Petro Poroshenko, his incumbent rival, was a more strident nationalist, anti-Kremlin figure, more of a hawk. And Zelensky won, and he kind of tried. And it became clear after a while. I mean, there was a bit of, brief rapprochement that Putin was not actually interested in peace whatsoever. And of course, the war carried on. And when I saw Zelensky just before the invasion, this was at a moment when Western diplomatic missions, including the Brits, had pulled their ambassadors out of Kiev and shunted them westward towards Lviv. And Zelensky had made it clear he was very unhappy about this because it didn't look too good. And I sort of said, well, why are you so unhappy? And he sort of said, he told me, we do not have a Titanic situation here. And I kind of muse in the book whether actually, Ukraine was the Titanic heading towards the Russian iceberg, or actually conversely, whether Russia was this kind of imperious, invincible ship heading towards Ukraine that on the surface looked quite small, but actually had more to it going on underneath. But whatever your metaphor, your conceit, what happened after invasion, and we can maybe talk a little bit about that day. What was this astonishing transformation? And I explore it in my book. I mean, I think part of it was that Zelensky is a former actor, and people are used to him dressing up and playing different roles. So when after February the 24th, he started appearing wearing this green T-shirt, in the uniform of a civilian volunteer, as a kind of war leader, but also an everyman. Everyone just went, "Oh, that's Zelensky in a different costume," and they saw this kind of chameleonic side to him. And the other thing I think, which I try and explore, is just his astonishing rhetorical, sort of ability. The fact that I think he's the planet's foremost communicator. And there's this astonishing video on day 3 of the invasion when he's outside his presidential palace. Everybody expects him to flee, and he holds the iPhone and he does a 30-second clip, and he just goes, "Ya tut, ya tut, I'm here, I'm here." And for me, that was a kind of pivotal moment in the war. I mean, I was in Kiev at the time, and it's impossible to overstate the mood of fear and dread and just kind of save yourselfness of that moment. And Zelensky stayed, and then of course Kiev survived. And the war had the art that you set out at the beginning, one from where people you were talking to were saying Ukraine's going to lose
Absolutely,
quickly,
within a week, yeah,
to the point where we're now talking sort of about Ukrainian victory.
And I mean, it seems to me it's not just Zelensky who comes into much sharper focus for the whole world, but also Ukraine itself. I mean, that I don't think most people, even in Europe, had a particularly distinct picture of Ukraine, and probably the few images they had were not that flattering, a bit poor, a bit corrupt, kind of backward. And then suddenly, I think there's been enormous admiration for Ukrainian resistance, but also recognition that they're a bit like us. I think that's part of the strong emotional reaction, that it was a more modern, more advanced society than we had realized. And I remember, I was at a conference in January, and there were a bunch of young Ukrainian MPs, and they were, super impressive. And Lawrence Friedman, the professor, was sitting next to me and said, if only we had some MPs like that in Britain, and this was all in English. They would speak. They would. So tell us a bit about. I mean, you obviously knew Ukraine very, very well, and you described Kiev as a sort of modern city and kind of happening European city before the invasion. But tell us a bit about what we should have known about Ukraine and how it's come into focus.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's sort of two things going on here. I mean, in terms of Kiev, I mean, I try and sort of conjure Kiev on the invasion when I was invited to dinner by Andrei Kurkov, the celebrated Ukrainian novelist, who's he's a brilliant man. He's a super writer, the author of numerous sort of playful and luminous books, and also sort of temperamentally, he was an optimist. So I was writing this rather apocalyptic story for The Guardian. I was late for this sort of Borscht invitation. And I went out, I was staying in the center of Kiev, and went out of my hotel, which was not very far away from the Golden Gate, a Soviet replica of one of the original medieval fortifications in Kiev. And, there was a woman outside busking on her violin, playing Edith Piaf numbers. There were old ladies selling tulips out of buckets. There were people dining, couples, families, in restaurants or sitting in coffee shops. And the point about Kiev is it is not some gloomy Soviet backwater. It is a vibrant, modern, European capital of 3 million people, with fantastic coffee, with artisanal pizza, with apps that you can order everything from, taxis to paying your income tax bill. And it's also full of beautiful people. I mean, I don't know if one is allowed to say that, but of both, of all and every kind, and hipsters going up the cobbled streets on e-scooters. And this world continued right up until the last moment. And I think people had taken their cue from Zelensky. They knew there was a possibility of invasion, but they didn't want to believe it. And so when it happened, it was just this shattering moment. And for me personally, I had a call about midnight from a Ukrainian contact of mine who said the invasion is going to begin at 4 a.m. And I went back from this dinner party with this dark velvet sky above me to my hotel. I slept for about 2 hours, then had a call. And then sure enough, at 4:30 a.m., the bombs started. There was this total shock and awe, military attack by Russia. And what we now know, I mean, it was pretty clear at the time, was the goal was to topple the government, kill Zelensky, liquidate Ukrainian resistance, and take over key government institutions, bring in.
Yeah. You write something that I didn't know. Perhaps I should have, but that they had pre-positioned sort of traitors, if I can put it that way, who were in a safe house near and tried to break in and kill Zelensky on the first day, or at least capture him.
Right. And then they were basically going to sort of, they came in from northeast, southwest. Well, they were bombing west, but they came in from three directions, sweeping up from Crimea. And the goal was to devour Ukraine, wipe it from the map, and formally an exit by summer. And this was a staggering, now we could say delusional plan, but they were enacting it. And
I think you write at some point that you think that Putin's key error, or one of them, was to underestimate or misunderstand the Ukrainian people. He just didn't recognize it as a real place and them as real people.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, there's a strong element of sort of chauvinism, and Putin is not the first leader to treat Ukrainians as vassals, to use the phrase used by Dmitry Medvedev, Putin's predecessor as president. But he wrote this essay, which I explore in Invasion, in the summer of 2021, where essentially he argued that Ukraine was never a state, and Ukrainians and Russians were one people, and they flow from a sort of similar or identical civilizational beginning point, which is Prince Volodymyr in the 10th century, who converted Kiev to Orthodox Christianity. And he says that that Ukraine has been artificially divided, from torn away from Russia by the Mongols, by the Poles, and by the meddling West. Now, I mean, this is a sort of crazy thesis. It's bad history. But what's striking about it is firstly that Putin blames Lenin for creating Ukraine as a sort of separate socialist republic in the 1920s, but is also channeling classical ideas of Russian imperialism and orthodoxy from about the 1830s, as if he's Nicholas I. He's sort of Tsar Putin I, Tsar Vladimir I. And it would be kind of darkly amusing were it not for the fact that this essay became a predicate for war. And I was talking to a Ukrainian intelligence sort of chief just in the run-up to all this, and he was saying the thing about the Russians is that we've always understood them better than they've understood us, and part of that is language. All Ukrainians are bilingual; they speak Russian and Ukrainian. Russians just speak Russian, and part of it is this sort of patronizing assumption that Ukrainians are essentially rural Russians. They're like the sort of stupid cousins. And of course they weren't, and that's why they resisted.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, there's this heroic story of resistance and of pushing them back from Kiev, and then pretty soon the Russians, as we discover, start committing pretty appalling war crimes in Bucha and Mariupol. They probably both deserve some attention. I mean, Bucha you were able to go into, as were other foreign correspondents. Mariupol, I believe nobody yet knows fully what happened there. But you think that something like 20,000 civilians have died there, which would be a war crime of absolutely historic proportions.
Yes, I mean, these were hard chapters to write. I mean, I write about Bucha, I write about Mariupol. I mean, I had left by the time the Russians encircled the city in late February and early March, but I was in touch with people I'd just met on my trip, and I interviewed survivors who managed to escape, including a woman with her kids who'd been in the drama theater with about 600 other women when it was bombed by a Russian warplane, killing around 500 people, including pregnant women as well. And I mean, it's hard to talk about. I mean, first of all, we have to acknowledge the scale of the conflict as a whole. I mean, this is the biggest war in Europe since 1945 for 80 years. It's the biggest refugee crisis. And Mariupol became a Guernica, I mean, or an Antwerp, or I mean, it's been completely destroyed. I mean, it was pulverized by Russian aviation, by Russian ship missiles, by tanks, by artillery, at a time when it was full of civilians, and it just kind of haunts me. I mean, when I was there, I saw a play by patriotic Ukrainians in Mariupol's aerodrome, and that it was a sort of traditional Christmas morality play. They had the devil, they had death, they had someone playing Putin with horns, and I saw this play, and that evening I went for a meal in a crowded Mariupol restaurant with women, with a live band, with women sort of dancing and the men looking embarrassed. I mean, the whole thing was kind of surreal. And thinking back about that afterwards,
Sure.
Fanciful or not, I could sort of almost, I imagine the sort of figure of death going through the restaurant, because essentially I mean, we don't know the precise number, but we know there's a list of thousands of people who were killed, some of whom were buried in courtyards, some of whom were buried in playgrounds, some of whom are still under the rubble. And one just episode haunts me. There was a volunteer I met called Anatoly Lazar, and I write about him in the book. Nice guy. We talked about Dostoevsky. We talked about, Russian literature. He took me to the front line, and then he called me, or I rang him about a weekend, and he said, "We're encircled, but we're fighting. It's going to be okay." And then he rang me about another week later, and he said, "Can you get my wife and kids out of Mariupol? Can you get them out?" And I said, "Look, I'm really sorry, Anatoly. I can't. I can write about your situation, but I'm not sure there's much I can do." And then he called me about another week later, and the connection was terrible. By that point, there was no electricity, there was snow, and I just heard the wind whipping off the Sea of Azov, and I couldn't hear him. It was just this emptiness. And after Mariupol fell, I looked for him among the dead. There's a long list of dead, thousands of names, and I looked for him among the living, and I couldn't find him. He was lost, and I feel guilty. Perhaps I shouldn't feel guilty, but I feel guilty.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to actually ask you about yourself, because I think that covering these wars, obviously there's a strong element of personal risk, but also, other war correspondents have talked about, suffering from traumatics, from trauma, from the horrors of the things that you've seen. And you write about somebody killed in Bucha, I think of Volodymyr, and you said that his death also haunted you afterwards. I mean, you seem, on the surface okay, but yeah, how do you keep going back and watching all these horrors? There must be something in you that thinks, maybe I'll just go back to Britain and turn away.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and thank you for it. I mean, I think the thing that is important is to focus on Ukrainians. I mean, they're the heroes of the story. They're the people writing an extraordinary chapter in their history, which will be talked about for generations. And I think what's happening in Ukraine more broadly is decolonization. I mean, it's a kind of anti-Soviet, anti-Russian revolt after decades, you might say, sort of centuries of repression, long periods where the Ukrainian language was banned by Tsarist Russia. The famine of 1932 and 1933, engineered by Stalin to punish Ukrainians, in which about 4 million people are thought to have died. And this is a kind of this is not just a war. It's an emancipatory moment, actually, where I mean, as I argue in the last chapter of the book, Ukraine is, I call it a proven state. I mean, we can talk about the war and its likely outcome, but I sort of feel as a nation, as a country, Ukrainians have sort of proven themselves to each other and to the world. And so, my job, I think, is just to kind of report on not just on the geopolitics. I mean, you and I both write on geopolitics, but on the human story.
Absolutely.
And on the fate of individuals who, unlike us war correspondents, don't have an opportunity to flee or take breaks. And I've traveled around the front lines all over, most recently in Kherson province. And I think my job is just to talk to them and to report what they say, obviously to contextualize as well, and to write kind of colorful and vivid dispatches. And these conversations stick with you. I mean, I just think of one in Kherson, and I went to this village called Myalova. No, I was the first journalist to get there, talk to a guy, and he gave me the tour. He showed me the school the Russians had blown up as they retreated, and there were booms going on. There were grab missiles going out. There were Russian rockets coming in from across the Dnieper River. And he said, "Look, we've gone back 30 years. We have no electricity. We have no water. We have no gas. We have no money. We have nothing. But we are free. We are free." And he also told me that he had sat secretly in his roof, watched the Russian heavy armor coming by, and had texted the coordinates to his son, who was in Dnipro in Ukrainian-controlled territory. He passed them on to the Ukrainian military. So the only way you get those stories is by being there. So I sort of think our job is not to big ourselves up as foreign correspondents, but to just tell the human story, and just lastly, to stick with it, at a time, for example, when the caravan may have moved on. I think we have to keep reporting.
Yeah. I mean, do you sense and do you fear that the caravan may be moving on? That, I mean, well, certainly at the beginning of the war, it dominated the nightly news in the UK, probably in other Western countries. Now it's sort of down the bulletin. Is that a danger for Ukraine?
I mean, I think it is a danger for Ukraine. I think it's one that the Ukrainian government is well aware of. Zelensky and his team are constantly trying to find ways to communicate with the world, to take Ukraine's story out there. I mean, he did this extraordinary virtual tour of national parliaments. He's talked to the Financial Times. I mean, he's given a whole series of interviews. Glastonbury. I imagine he may pop up at the other events kind of in the coming weeks and months. But to be honest with you, I don't sense. I mean, I've done a few events since the book came out, and I don't sense Ukraine fatigue. On the contrary, I think there's still continuing interest. There are so many people in the UK and beyond who have been hosting refugees. Other people who have been supporting them. The Ukrainians living abroad, who are deeply engaged by what's going on, are in touch with family all the time, including today when another 70 missiles were fired by Russia at Kiev and other cities. I mean, I think for now, the kind of anti-Kremlin international coalition, the thing you've been writing about a lot, is holding up pretty well. Now, it doesn't include everybody. There's the global south, India, China, South Africa, who are not part of that coalition. But for now, I think it's there. And what Zelensky says, to go back to one of your sort of previous questions, is this is not our struggle. This is not just a local war or a regional war. This is everybody's struggle. It's a kind of universal struggle, because essentially the war is for the future of the world order, whether we have a kind of nihilistic, or you can say 19th century world order where big states can smash up smaller states and roll over them, which is what Putin wants, where you've got spheres of influence. Or whether however imperfectly you have a world where international law sort of works, but where it's all about sort of human rights and decency. And what the Ukrainians want is they just want to be allowed to live freely and make their own sovereign choices, and to integrate with the West. And this is something Vladimir Putin is trying to stop.
Yeah. Now, in about 10 minutes, I'm going to go to the Q&A. I can see that 10 questions have already arrived. I haven't read them yet, but we'll do so in a sec. Just to tell and I gather there's something like 400 people online, which tell you something about the lack of Ukraine fatigue and the interest in your book. But others who want to put questions, do type away in the question function, and I'll relay some of them to Luke in about 10 minutes or so. But just maybe the last question from me before I turn to the audience. What's your, I mean, I think, you do a masterful job, as you say, of telling the human stories behind all of this, and it's crucial not to lose sight of those. But when you look at the kind of overall situation of the war, what's your view of it? I mean, it's gone through several cycles, hasn't it? There was the initial Ukraine's going to lose in a week, then, oh my God, Russia's dropped back from Kiev, then they seem to be doing a bit better, and then, Kharkiv, Kherson. And I think until maybe a couple of weeks ago, my sense was that people felt that Russia was kind of, if not flat on its back, really doing badly, and that Ukraine was going forward. Now, Russia seems to have discovered a very destructive, effective new weapon, which is the destruction of Ukrainian infrastructure. People are talking about a stalemate going forward. You know both countries very well. I mean, you've been banned now from Russia, but you've lived there for a long time. How do you see this, this playing out? Do you think that Russia may have more resilience than we've given it credit for, or do you think that actually Ukraine will win, whatever that means?
Yeah, I mean, there's sort of several answers to that. I mean, from a sort of a strategic point of view, it's pretty clear that Russia has basically lost. In other words, the original goal, which was to capture Kiev, kill Zelensky, install, a pro-Russian, pro-peace government and annex everything, that has failed. That's patently failed, and Russia has lost about half of the territory that it seized in the early weeks of the campaign. I mean, it's been kicked out. It hasn't really worked as a military operation. Now it's been through several iterations, as you say, and it seems to me now that Russia's focus is very much on the Donbass. We've seen these extraordinary sort of unidirectional attacks on Bakhmut. Well, I've been to Bakhmut in the summer. It was pretty hairy, scary trip, and the Russians are now on the edges of Bakhmut. It's a town in Donbass, but it's not hugely strategically significant. But I think it's politically significant because Putin has decided that if he can conquer the Donbass or most of it, he can sell victory to the Russian people and say that his special military operation has been a success. Meanwhile, we've seen, just today, we've seen Ukrainian attacks deep into Russian territory using, it seems, some kind of long-range drone, strike drone. And the Ukrainians all the way through have shown a creativity, a sort of innovative capacity which few had expected. I mean, they've blown up the bridge to Crimea, the Russian bridge. They've been attacking Crimean targets. They've sunk the Moskva in the spring, this invincible Russian warship. And I think what I expect in the spring is further Ukrainian advances, possibly recapturing more territory in the south. I think the east will be bitterly contested. I don't see this war ending anytime soon. I think Putin still thinks he can kind of win, although what winning is, I'm not entirely sure from his perspective. But I think the Ukrainians will keep going forward, if only because they're just so motivated. I mean, Zelensky was talking about this in his latest address this morning, and he was saying correctly the difference between us and them is we are motivated. And you talk to any Ukrainian soldier on the battlefield, and you say, well, why are you fighting? And they say, I'm defending my family, my wife, my kids, my village, my home, my language, our way of life, my country. And the Russians, by contrast, it's not very clear what they're fighting for, really. So I think Ukraine will prevail, but that's not the same as deoccupying everything. But it's going to be a long war.
And just a last thing before I come to the audience. We've heard a lot about Russian losses. I think at some point the Pentagon said they'd lost between 80 and 100,000 people killed or wounded. But Ukrainian losses have also been heavy, haven't they? And it's a smaller country. Can they keep it up?
Yeah, I mean, Ukraine is acknowledging about 9,000 soldiers killed in action, many more wounded. I mean, the figure may be higher. I don't know. I'm in no position to say. All I can say is that it's terrible. It's sad. There are so many kids who've lost parents. I mean, just on my last trip, I went round. I was just walking past the main cathedral. Orthodox Church of Ukraine Cathedral in the center of Kiev, and there was a funeral going on. There are funerals happening all the time. There's an open coffin. That's the sort of tradition with family there. And there's also a sort of tradition which the Ukrainians have adopted since 2014, which is, I just think it's incredibly moving. I can scarcely see it, without churning up. But when fallen soldiers come back to their villages or their communities, the entire population kneels. So you get men, women, children, old ladies kneeling by the side of the road as this cortege goes past. And it's not, it's not 5 or 10 people, it's hundreds of people kneeling. And the price has been enormous. I mean, some of the best and brightest people, have been killed. I mean, not that they count any more or any less than anyone else, but some the people who are dying are not just professional soldiers. Quite often they're journalists or IT workers or ballet dancers or whatever, people who've gone and fought. And it's an incredible cost. It's an incredible cost. And I think this calculation will inform the shape of Ukraine's offenses going forward, because what the Ukrainians are very keen to avoid are the sort of suicidal operations that the Russians are doing, where they're throwing hundreds, thousands of newly mobilized guys into the Minsa, very often for really meager territorial gains. Zelensky is mindful of this, but what choice do they have? I mean, they say for us it's existential. If we stop fighting, we are subjugated and we become slaves. They don't want to be slaves. They want to be free and they want to be independent.
Yeah. Very well put. Let me just go to the questions. I'll kind of group them because there are quite a few that are similar in kind of intent. A few about Putin. The first question to come up was from a guy called Steve. He says, "Can we assume that Putin just miscalculated when he thought that Kiev would fall?" And the second one from somebody else, an anonymous question, saying, "Do you think he'll eventually go nuclear?" And if I add a third one, the other question that you often hear about Putin, and again, none of us have a complete answer, but I'd be interested to hear what you say. How secure is his position?
Yeah, they're all really fascinating questions, and it's quite interesting. We're here we are in 2022, and actually, I wonder, Gideon. I mean, you've written a lot of books and read a lot of history. To me, it almost feels as if there's less reliable information now than there was in the late Soviet Union about Brezhnev and the various sort of gerontocratic Politburo leaders. I mean, there's plenty of speculation. There's a lot of disinformation and rumor. Very hard to know. But I think what we can say about the invasion is that, there's a paradox here that Putin thinks he thinks he's a brilliant spy. He thinks he's a kind of intelligence maestro. Actually, he was a rather mediocre spy. The kind of cool, clever Soviet spies got New York or Paris or London, and he got Dresden, the second city in East Germany. And nonetheless, I think the FSB, I think like all dictators, essentially he began to lose touch with reality, and essentially his own FSB spy agency, which was liaising with Russian assets inside Ukraine, told him what he wanted to hear. And what he wanted to hear was that Ukrainians would essentially rise up and welcome Russian troops, and that there was a corrupt, pro-Western, decadent, thin layer at the top, the Zelensky government, and that most Ukrainians were just waiting to be liberated from their Nazi rulers. Now, this is what you get on Russian state TV, and Putin appears to have believed that that was the reality. And of course, it isn't the reality. And I think the mistake he made was to think that the Ukraine of 2022 was the Ukraine of 2014, when there was a kind of pro-Russian minority, which he took advantage of. 8 years later, and after a kind of horrendous war, in fact, Putin, more than anyone else, had kind of helped consolidate sort of pro-Ukrainian patriotic feeling. And when those troops came in, that they were met with fire and fury, not just from the Ukrainian army, but from everybody. On the nuclear aspect, my idea, which is completely unempirical, and feel free to disagree with it, is I am skeptical that Putin will use a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine, because his foreign intelligence chief tells him every week that they have foiled 3 plots by the Americans to kill him. I mean, Putin is conspiratorial. He's paranoid. He believes the West wants to destroy him. And so I think were he to use a tactical nuclear weapon, his fear is the Americans would seek him out and drop a bomb on his head. And the one image we have of Putin of the last 2 years, which we know is real, is of a small man at the end of a long table, a very long table, talking to his chief of staff or whoever, and of a man who's clearly paranoid about his personal survival and health. So I don't see a nuclear scenario. And as for Palace Coup, we've all watched The Death of Stalin. I mean, it's a wonderful film by Armando Iannucci. And if only life were like a kind of Netflix drama with a Aristotelian resolution and a kind of body in a courtyard. But unfortunately, I just don't see it. I think, we'd like Putin to shuffle off, or the verb Ukrainians use to me always is croak, but I don't think he's going to croak, unfortunately, anytime soon. And I think, policymakers, observers, Western governments have to go with the assumption that Putin is going to be there for some time to come.
Yeah, and just a quick word from me, because certainly I've sort of reporting on the diplomatic end of what's in the West and so on. I've certainly been struck by, whether rightly or wrongly, the Americans have been very preoccupied from the beginning by the threat of nuclear war, and I think it has constrained the aid that they've given to the Ukrainians. For example, the limiting of the range of the missiles they've given them, and so on. And as on Putin and the death wish, Well, I put this to a Russian friend. I'm sure you know him, Sasha Gabuev, and he said, "Well, they've got loads and loads of nuclear bunkers in Moscow, which they've been sort of dusting down and preparing. So he probably would be well safely underground by the time they used a tactical nuclear weapon." But I think even the people who are most alarmed by it think it's, at most, I don't know if this is reassuring, 1 in 4 that he would use it in extremis. But these numbers are probably meaningless. But it is interesting. Just if it sounds a bit sort of bloodless, but in terms of international relations, I don't think we've ever seen a kind of nuclear standoff quite like this. Somebody using nuclear weapons not just to deter, but as cover for aggression to deter the response, which kind of brings me to the next set of questions, where lots of people are saying, what should the West be doing? Are we doing enough in terms of material aid, diplomatic aid, military aid, or even individuals who are watching and upset about what's going on and would like to help? What can you say?
Yeah, first of all, I think we need to acknowledge error. And it's been quite interesting. I don't know how you see it, but there's been quite a lot of finger pointing from the Anglo-Saxons at the Germans, for example, the fact they became addicted to Russian gas and did Nord Stream 1, Nord Stream 2, and under Angela Merkel, and Gerhard Schröder, but basically successive German leaders made the mistake of thinking that you could decouple economics and trade from politics, and from the fact that actually the Putin regime was lurching towards where it is now, which I think I would describe as totalitarian. Essentially, I mean, dissent has become impossible, and it's not quite the 1930s again, but I think it's more oppressive, certainly in the late Soviet period. And so that perhaps was the German mistake, but I think we in the UK made a similar mistake, possibly a worse mistake, which is that we became addicted to Russian money, and actually the Russian money over the past couple of decades has cascaded into this country in various forms, where we've seen oligarchs buying football clubs, buying newspapers, buying peers of the realm, essentially by giving them jobs on boards. We've seen massive Russian-linked donations to the Conservative Party, and we've also seen plenty of evidence of Russian malfeasance in the shape of murders of Alexander Litvinenko in 2006, about whom I wrote a book, A Very Expensive Poison, Sergei Skripal a few years ago, and so on. And actually the response up until the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February has been weak and conventional, and really has confirmed Putin in his belief that the West is irresolute, poorly led, and the politicians can be bought if the price is right. So I think what we have to do is conclusively disprove that idea that we're basically feeble, but by continuing to support Ukraine, as I was saying earlier, but also supporting Ukraine militarily. And I think the Biden calculation that we could go to nuclear escalation, I think we're beyond that. I think now the Ukrainians need to win. I mean, they prove that they are resilient, that they are clever, that they are creative. We need to give them weapons so they can deoccupy more of their territory, whether it's Patriots, whether it's long-range artillery, whether it's tanks. We've got to keep going, first of all, and also just to continue to support Ukrainians morally. And just so one last thing on this, with the person we haven't mentioned so far this evening, Gideon, is Boris Johnson. Now it may surprise you to learn that I'm not exactly a fan of Boris Johnson, but on Ukraine, I think he got it right. And all of my attempts to tell my Ukrainian friends that he's a liar and he's a charlatan and he's an immoralist count for nothing, because they just say, we love Boris Johnson. He gave us anti-tank weapons. He supported us. He's the most popular Western politician in Ukraine by several million miles. And you walk through Kiev, you go past an art gallery, there are pictures of Boris Johnson dressed as a Cossack playing a lute. There are murals of him all over buildings. There's even a rap song, Gideon, I kid you not, which is quite a good rap song. You hear it whenever you get into a taxi, which is a addictive kind of beat, and then a chorus line of Boris Johnson saying, "Dobry dzień, everybody," which means good day, everybody. So I mean, look,
did it cause you to revise your opinion of Boris Johnson?
Yeah, I mean, it did a little bit, because he was there in April. I was there in April. Kiev was empty, it was dangerous, there was nowhere to eat, there was an 8 p.m. curfew. You wondered if and when you were going to be whacked by a Russian missile, and he came.
Mm.
And I think he and actually any Western politician who goes to Kiev at the moment deserves some respect, whatever you think of their domestic politics, for being personally brave. And of course, any British prime minister, and they keep changing every 5 minutes. What could be better than shaking hands with Volodymyr Zelensky and hoping that some of Zelensky's stardust falls on top of your head?
Mm. But I think in Johnson's case, it probably was one of the few things he genuinely felt pretty deeply about.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably he was sincere, and he was talking about Ukrainian victory back in February, March, when no one was talking about Ukrainian victory, and Ukrainians remember that, and that's why he's sort of so celebrated. And I think we need to keep thinking about Ukrainian victory, what form it might take, how we bring it about, and going forward, how we deal with, or I would argue, contain this aggressive, revisionist, unpredictable Russia, where the Russian political elite, as one UK diplomat put it to me, he said the problem with them is they don't think the way we think they should think.
Yeah. Can I just press you though on what victory would look like? Because, you said Putin's not going to fall. We're not going to occupy Moscow. So doesn't that imply that at some point there's a deal of some sort, something that ends the war? Or are they driven militarily out of Crimea and just kind of give up? How do you see that going?
Well, I mean, I think if there is a sort of dilemma for the West, it will be let's go with an optimistic scenario where Ukraine manages to liberate more territory next year, most of the south, let's say, not all of the east, but perhaps some more in Lugansk, perhaps the left bank of the Dnieper, pushes towards the border with Crimea. Is the West all in for the liberation of Crimea, or do they say, well, actually, look, you've kind of restored where you were in February 2022. Now is the moment to sit down with Putin. Now, what Zelensky would say, I imagine, is, I know his speechwriter pretty well, is that we cannot trust any peace deal with the Russians because Putin will merely use the sort of pause tactically to regroup, build up his forces again with a view to another attack and maybe another attempt to seize Kiev, which I don't rule out at all. Therefore, we have to keep going until Russia is completely destroyed. I mean, all I would say is that I think it's up to Ukrainians to define victory. That they've lost so much by this point. They have to explain, make the case. And if they wish to continue and liberate Crimea as well, then I feel that we should support them. But ultimately, it's their call.
Right. A kind of up-to-date question from Kirsty Lang. She says, what's your reaction to today's Ukrainian drone attacks on Russian military bases deep inside Russia?
Funnily enough, Kirsty, I made a fatal mistake. Gideon, you'll know about this, of coming into the Guardian office to do this event, and I
got grabbed
10 seconds into the building when from my foreign editors saw me like some kind of human hawk, and just asked me to write a kind of analysis piece on this latest strike. And I would just sort of say two things. One is my kind of Ukrainian contacts have been hinting for a while that something was coming, and you never quite know what the something is. What the something appears to be are drones with long-range capability, capable of hitting targets deep inside Russia, possibly with a 1,000-kilometer radius. And will that stop Russian attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure? No, it won't. But might it give the Russians pause for thought? I think yes, it will. And it's just a further example of Ukrainian ingenuity. I mean, some of the stuff they've been doing, I mean, the thing that most surprised me were these sea drones. I don't know if you saw the footage when the Ukraine used air and sea drones to attack Sevastopol harbor in occupied Crimea. But it was like something out of James Bond. I mean, there was a live video feed from this drone. There was a Russian helicopter that had picked it up and was trying to shoot it out the water. You could see the machine gun bullets splooshing into the waves. And these drones blew up or appear to have damaged at least 2 or 3 frigates. And it's, reporting on this war is this extraordinary mashup between First World War trenches, which I visited, which look like something out of 1915, with mud and with underground shelters and with mortars, and then you climb out of the trench and you see three guys playing with a joystick, and they're the drone operators sending coordinates of the Russian positions to the artillery guys somewhere else down the line, and they're being transmitted by one of Elon Musk's Starlink satellite systems, which is stuck under a tree. And you know, my sense is that the Ukrainians, you know, yes, they're outgunned, but they're just so much nimbler. They're using technology. They're brilliant at military logistics. They've got people who've come back from Silicon Valley to work on this. I just think they will continue to kind of menace and harry Russian targets wherever they are.
Yeah, actually, you've half answered a question, which another question which I was going to pick off from the thing, but only half. So I'll give you the chance to have another go at it. Somebody says, "Can we really expect the Ukrainians to win with one arm tied behind their back?" In other words, you know, Russia's allowed to bomb Ukrainian infrastructure, but the West would be quite horrified if, you know, Ukrainians, if they started to attack Russian infrastructure around Moscow. So it's not a fair fight, is it? It's not an even fight.
It's not a fair fight, but I think today, to go back to Kirsty's point, I mean, today just shows Ukraine's growing capabilities, and there's a really interesting conversation. And if anyone wants to get in touch with me afterwards, especially if they work for a Ministry of Defense, let's say, or a secret organization, I'm Luke.Harding at theguardian.com, is how much Ukraine tells the Americans and the Brits and their European allies of what they're doing in advance when it comes to targeting inside Russia. But I think we're going to see more of what we saw today. There's got to be a quid pro quo for all these cruise missiles smashing up, you know, Ukrainian electricity infrastructure. You imagine the Ukrainians will retaliate. I mean, what they've done so far, which has been very smart, is unlike the Russians who've killed civilians, you know, indiscriminately without much caring. The Ukrainians, by and large, have just been targeted the Russian military. But I can see them doing that with a much greater radius and range, and striking more targets inside the Russian Federation.
Yeah, for what it's worth, and it may not be worth very much, but when I asked the Americans on a recent trip to Washington, had they known that the Ukrainians were going to attack the Kerch Bridge, they said no. But you know, who knows? On the another question there's several about food. I think people, you know, you raised the horrible memory of the famine in the 1930s. Obviously, the harvest is going to be affected by by the war. Do the Ukrainians have enough food to keep going?
I mean, the Ukrainians have enough food. I mean, if you drive through Ukraine in summer, I mean, it is amazing. I mean, you could go for hundreds of miles where you just go past these massive Soviet era fields full of sunflowers or other crops. I mean, one of the reasons that Ukraine has always been such a sort of desirable place for conquest over the centuries is its earth. It just has this astonishing earth. You put something in it, and it's like Jack and the Beanstalk. It just grows enormously and vigorously. So they have enough food. The problem is the economy has been shattered. I mean, what Russia has done by destroying electricity is effectively destroyed the economy. I mean, it's how can you work when you've got no internet connection? How can you run a business? How can you talk to your partners outside the country? And how can you export? I mean, the grain corridor initiative has worked pretty well. I mean, the grain has been going out to other places, but most of the economy is ruined. And I think, just to go back to the sort of war and its outcome, Putin's calculation is that this is a long attritional conflict where he will just grind Ukraine into the dirt and calculate that sooner or later the West will flake out, as it has done in the past. So that has not to happen. But I think if Ukraine can survive this winter, and I think it will survive this winter, I think things will move on the battlefield and in other arenas from about February, March onwards.
Yeah. So we've only got about 4 minutes left, but that leads naturally on to the last question. Russian resilience. I mean, again, you've been in Ukraine for not Russia, but what's your sense? How long can they keep this up? I mean, they've had heavy casualties, and we don't really know. I don't have a sense of Russian public opinion and how much that even is a factor. But what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, again, my view is it's not hugely empirical, but it's a hard thing to measure. My sense from talking to Russians, most of them now living in exile. I mean, there are many people who oppose the war and have fled. Some a while ago, some since March. But my sense is that there is or that there was a sort of passionate minority against the war in places like Moscow and St. Petersburg. I mean, we saw a lot of anti-war demonstrations early on, with upward of sort of 15,000 people arrested. There's a sort of minority who passionately support the war, and that's definitely the view which is promulgated on state TV. And you have a majority who kind of who do support, but kind of more passively. And that's briefly, Gideon, is because propaganda works, and we've seen over the years massive dehumanizing rhetoric, which has portrayed Ukrainians as unpeople, as vermin, as scum. And we've also seen, the first thing that Putin did when he took over 2 decades ago was control TV. So the message is very tightly controlled. Propaganda works, and unfortunately, most Russians support it. And what's weird is you've got a lot of young men who have fled to other countries, principally, Georgia and Armenia, but they haven't crossed the border and become anti-war activists. Many of them support the war. They just don't want to die in it themselves. So I think Putin unfortunately has a pretty close lid on what's going on inside Russia, and he can rely on sort of pretty strong domestic support going forward.
Well, I always like to try and end on a positive note, so I failed there because that's a slightly gloomy note. But Luke, thanks for an absolutely fascinating hour of discussion. Thanks to everyone who posed questions in the chat. Sorry if I didn't get to them all, but there were many of you who wanted to participate, which I think is a tribute to how much interest Luke's book has aroused. So let me just thank you for last time and hand back to Jack.
Can I just say one last thing, which is just who's watching that thank you very much from me. But just to say that Ukraine needs your continuing support and empathy. So don't change channel. Do think about it. Ukrainians, some of them watching, they're just like you and me, and they deserve our engagement now and next year as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Luke, and back to 5 by 15 and to Jack, just to round it up.
Thank you so much, Luke and Gideon, for that conversation. And thank you, Luke, for that message, which is such a powerful, important one for us to hear. That was such a compelling and informative conversation. It was fantastic to hear your insights and that you both went into it with such depth. And thank you too to our audience for all of your great questions. It was excellent to see, as you mentioned, that we're a long way from Ukraine fatigue, and it's vital that we stay that way. Please do purchase copies of Gideon's and Luke's books. Author royalties from Invasion will go to the DEC's Ukraine Humanitarian Appeal, and there's more information about the books in the chat. Just a quick shout out for what we have coming up in the new year at 5 by 15. We have the first event in an exciting new partnership with Rathbones, which is a continuation of the Earth Convention series that started back in 2020. The theme for the new series is the 4 elements, and our first panel event on the 16th of January will be about Earth, featuring Misha Glenny, Isabella Tree, Philip Limbury, and Sophie Lawrence in conversation with our own Rosie Boycott. You won't want to miss it. A few days later, on the 19th of January, we have an in-person charity gala event at the Tabernacle in Notting Hill to celebrate 15 years of the amazing School Food Matters, with Andy Oliver, Tim Spector, Dan Saladino, Dermot Gavin, and Rena Reid. There'll be some fascinating reflections on food, culture, and policy, and we'll have some school children there with us on the night serving canapes. All ticket sales will go to School Food Matters, all the profits, so please do bag yourselves a ticket while they're still available. As ever, all of the info and the ticket links are available on the 5 by 15 website. Thank you all very much, and thank you again, Luke and Gideon, for your fantastic discussion. Good night.